Trisha Meyer is an assistant professor in digital governance and participation at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel and a professorial fellow at the United Nations University CRIS in Bruges. Trisha researches the regulatory push toward and the social consequences of tech platforms taking proactive and automated measures to moderate content. In this context, she has co-authored a study on the use of artificial intelligence to tackle disinformation for the European Parliament. This was published in 2019, and a study mapping global responses to disinformation for UNESCO, which was published this year. We're really thrilled that she could join us today. So without further ado, I'm going to give Trisha the floor to speak, and afterwards we will have a Q&A for her as well, so please continue to pose your questions into the chat. Thank you so much. Trisha, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks. Do you prefer if I advance my slides or if I let you know?
I think let's have you try to advance your slides, and then if you say next slide, that will show us that we should do the slides instead.
Okay.
We'll learn in here.
Happy to try it. But indeed, it seems that the Cisco way of advancing slides is not super obvious, because I've seen many yeah, it just keeps saying click mouse to get control. Cisco has an improvement to make here on that aspect. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so hi everyone, great to have you to be with you this afternoon. I've been able to follow a lot of the sessions over the past few days. And essentially what I'm doing here is responding to some of what was shared by Google and Facebook, and to share some of the analysis that I've been doing with a great team of researchers over the past 2 years. So we can go on to the next slide. Yeah. Back another one. Sorry. Yeah. So I just wanted to start out with a bit of framing, and then I'm going to give you some of the theoretical underpinnings that I also often use, that I share with my students, but that I think help us to kind of understand what's going on here at a larger scale. I recently listened again to Mark Zuckerberg's hearing, the hearing that was held within the European Parliament. This is kind of what Cambridge Analytica was, yeah, we were kind of in that fray and gaining an understanding of what had happened after the Brexit referendum as well. And one thing that struck me with this particular hearing was what I put there on a quote, which is in the first few minutes of his response after he had been grilled essentially by these European parliamentarians, of a shift of recognizing or kind of underlining that automation and proactive intervention was necessary. Until then, I saw that Facebook had primarily had this kind of, still does, if we were thinking of political speech, this hands-off approach of not really recognizing or wanting to acknowledge the role of being an editor and very much moderating its content. And I really saw kind of this inflection point happening in 2017, 2018 of needing to kind of intervene more proactively. And that's something that, frankly, I find necessary, but also concerning if it's not done in a way that is transparent and it is not done in a way that civil society, academics, and policymakers can really gain an understanding of how the platforms are actually curating the content that they're dealing with. This isn't unique to Facebook, even though the example that I give here is that. Okay, on to the next slide. So Laura Donardis, I'm going to refer to two American scholars in this context, Laura Donardis and Lawrence Lessig, good old Larry. But first, Donardis, in her 2014 book, kind of gave this indication of what are trends when we're looking at digital policy or internet governance, whatever you want to call it, and this recognition that we have, bullet point 3 in particular, this privatization of internet governance. And that the technology itself is a technology that can be used for good or for bad. That technology is not neutral, but rather that it is what it is based on how we design it. It'll emphasize particular values. And I think when we're reflecting on platform responses to disinformation, this is important to take with us. On the one hand, that private companies are making enormous decisions on what free speech essentially is, and that it all comes down in the end to what is in the policies and how the technology is either recommending or demoting particular content. On to the next slide. So Lawrence Lessig, back in 2006 already, was talking a lot about different modes of regulation. And I'll just point out here in this figure to the architecture. The example, if I recall correctly, is how you reduce speeding. So physically on the road, how do you ensure that people don't speed? Well, one way that you can do that is by putting in a speed bump. And so that's an architectural intervention that you make in order to encourage particular behavior. In the online environment, it's actually the same, and we've very much started to emphasize the technological interventions that can be made, and recognition that these actors, we were back then talking mostly about internet access providers and how you can prevent piracy, etc. We've kind of moved on as we in this space, but it's essentially the same thing, right? Of reflecting on what role those who are providing the services, whether that's access or a particular application, what role that they can play, and a recognition that the technology itself matters. So we're talking about the shaping of technology, but also the shaping through technology. All right, we can go on. So that is kind of a background in terms of what we're discussing here. Essentially, is what shape we think the online environment should have, what kind of behavior we should be encouraging. And that relates to disinformation, but also a lot of other factors, right? So Claire very kindly introduced me and indicated some of the work that I've been contributing to, and the one which I'm sure that Julie Passetti will mention in the next session as well is a UNESCO ITU Broadband Commission report that came out, was launched this past Tuesday, came out earlier in September. And this study was reflecting on 11 different responses that are given to disinformation. I was the lead author on several of these chapters, and what I want to zoom in on right now is the curatorial responses. So we can go on to the next slide. What essentially I was looking at here was how have platforms, in terms of their policies, so that's the editorial policies, the community guidelines, the terms of service, how are they dealing with harmful content and disinformation? And here I can just echo kind of what was shared earlier on in the session, that often these responses are not necessarily specific to disinformation, but they are targeting particular behaviors, as well as content that might be disinformative, but it also could be hate speech. There could be an incitement to violence, etc. And so the responses that they try to be as was mentioned, content agnostic. And so the typology kind of that I used in terms of how they deal with content and account moderation goes across and applies also to disinformation and specifically to COVID-19 as well. So what we did, so this is one chapter of a 345-page report, if I recall correctly, the exact page numbers, was that in this particular chapter, we analyzed 11 different, the policy, the platform policies of the 11 largest internet communication companies, social media platforms across the world. We tried to have more than just a Western perspective. The COVID-19 case study that we did zoom in kind of on Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And what you notice, just to give that hint towards COVID-19 measures, is that really what we noticed was there was a promotion of authoritative content, but as well a very large increase in the automation of content moderation, but not accompanied with review procedures, in particular kind of a decrease even of the guarantee that there can be a review procedure and appeal mechanism. So we can move on. And I just want to run through very briefly the 7 different types of content and account moderation that we looked at. And kind of on the right, you see the mapping that we did, where I don't have time to kind of go into these differences between the platforms, but especially when we come to transparency measures and appeal mechanisms, you'll notice that there's a pretty big difference. None of the platforms do very well, but there are some that do worse than others. On the left, kind of what you see in the text is the response that there has been specifically related to COVID, and so mind you, those are specific to YouTube, Facebook, well, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, the analysis that we did here. So the first two ways that we see that platforms kind of deal with disinformation and moderate content more generally is through flagging and reviewing of content, and then as well the promotion and demotion of content. A lot of this is the flagging in particular, and the review increasingly so as well is automated. So I gave the figure here that in YouTube's transparency, the Google transparency report, they indicate that only 4.84% of what was flagged was actually reported, or what was removed was reported, so was flagged by humans in the beginning of 2020. That's kind of incredible. And what we notice in terms of promotion and demotion of content is that in particular the promotion of content and of authoritative sources during COVID-19 was accelerated. There's been a bit of reticence in terms of determining what is truth or determining what is a provider that you might want to promote further, but it was very clear during the pandemic when we're dealing with health disinformation that this was something that the platforms were very willing to do. Can go on to the next slide. 2 additional ways then, and here we're also looking at account moderation, that the platforms intervene are these restrictions. So you'll notice these R's that were mentioned, the raise, remove, reduce, reward. This comes back here in my presentation as well. Where I, from a perspective of often reflecting on freedom of expression, sometimes have difficulties is when we are when we're demoting or we're removing content without there being appeal mechanisms or transparency mechanisms involved. And so what we noticed here in terms of COVID in particular is that there was removal of videos, claims, and hashtags, and I'm not trying to indicate that this is something that we shouldn't be doing. I believe that some of this can even be automated, but we do need to ensure that we have robust mechanisms to kind of ensure that we know what's going on, how this is being done, and in particular that there are ways of kind of intervening when things do go wrong. So we can go on to the next slide. And this kind of leads to an important part that I see where you'll notice there's more blanks on the right side of the column here, is that prior to, but also during the pandemic, there's been not a great amount of assurance, I would say, that you can be sure that particular content will be reviewed. It has increased incredibly over time, but still the granularity in terms of knowing the particular reasons, for instance, that content has been taken down, that accounts have been suspended, etc. There is certainly room for improvement. So I'll go on in the interest of time to my conclusion, which is that I think, echoing a lot of what has been said here in the previous days as well, what we notice is that, one, the responses are not necessarily coordinated. We are moving towards a regulatory response in multiple countries across multiple continents. We're not there yet, right? And in that regulatory vacuum, what we notice is that there's a lot of fragmentation in terms of the response. And you could indicate that perhaps is due to the different nature of the platforms. I don't think it's helpful, though, from the perspective, from a societal perspective, and certainly not in terms of perspective of knowing exactly what we can do and what we can expect and exactly what is going on. So by having their own curatorial yardstick, I would say, they essentially are the definers and the judges, the enforcers of freedom of expression on their services. It's kind of their prerogatory. We're using their services, but at the same time, it is also evident that this technology is the technology through which we gain our understanding of politics, of news often, especially with younger generations, and therefore that it is very much time to kind of think through how the policies are being developed, that is very much in need of a multi-stakeholder process in this, and that there is also far more regularity, that there is consistency and harmonization across the platforms, and I would say in particular when it comes to appeal mechanisms and the transparency mechanisms that need to accompany this. All right, I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to kind of have a discussion with others on this topic as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Trisha. So we have a couple questions coming in. I'm going to pose one. Platforms are relying more and more on automated mechanisms, algorithms, and the idea that this is a more neutral way of dealing with content. Do you think that, one, do you think this can be neutral? And also, do you think there's a way that civil society should be engaging more in this to actually help ensure a different kind of sort of social neutrality?
Of course it's not neutral. Technology is not neutral. It can be, I do recognize the narrative that it is often seen as a way of not being dependent on a human kind of determining in terms of content, for instance, whether it is hate speech or not. but there's always the process of having determined what is and what isn't, and humans have been involved in there as well. I do think there is a great need for automation of content moderation. I think as well some of the reports that have come out, the reporting on what kind of toll it takes on humans, looking day after day at violent content, for instance. Just there from a human perspective, we see the need for that, but also in terms of just the scale of what needs to be done, right? But I don't think we should pretend that it's, or we should accept any indication that this would be something that is a better or a more neutral outcome than if humans have been involved. I think that can often be a way of kind of covering up and not giving, of kind of just having to trust the technology. I think we all need to be able to go back and see why decisions have been made, even if they're automated, and that information needs to be publicly available as well.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat from Claire Melford, actually who was one of our panelists yesterday, or 2 days ago, asking, do we want governments or commercial companies making these kinds of determinations about harmful content? Or do we need a more independent, neutral, perhaps a nonprofit entity? So this is also thinking a lot about our session yesterday where we were talking about regulation and then what governance for this regulation. So yeah, who is equipped to do this and how? Simple question.
Yeah. No, I don't trust government. No, I don't trust private companies. Yes, I think a multi-stakeholder approach and one where civil society is involved is the way forward, right? And we see that kind of steps are made towards that. So I'm thinking here of the Facebook Oversight Board, far from perfect, right? But an approach that is not, first of all, specific to one platform, but is actually reflecting across platforms would be forward. And I'm thinking here also of some of the recommendations that David Kay has made in the past of kind of thinking of a board or an entity that could work across platforms that is also geographically diverse, not a feat or something for the faint-hearted, but I would very much prefer that to something where it is essentially private companies and governments deciding on what is acceptable.
Thank you. Yeah, in our panel yesterday, also on regulation, there was a discussion about social media councils and how they should perhaps where their contours are geographically. Do you have any thoughts on this? I know that your research has looked at platforms globally. So do you think that there's some localization that would need to happen with this sort of model?
Yeah, content that there's cultural specificities and sensitivities. Obviously, I think beyond thinking of kind of cultures, languages matter as well, right? And so here, it's true. I should have mentioned more strongly kind of the role that media has to play in this, and media councils, of kind of having been the curators of what is newsworthy, and still very much, I think if COVID showed us anything, it's that also people are looking for reliable content. So in that context, yes, I can only concur that there's a need of something that is both goes across kind of across boundaries, geographical boundaries, then, but also still has that has the ability, so we're also not talking about one thing necessarily, but within national or cultural linguistic contexts as well.
Great. Another question coming in from Warren Zhu, who's asking about if you can speak about sort of maybe bright spots on particular platforms. Are there any initiatives that you're seeing from certain platforms that have been more effective at identifying and removing disinformation that you could share as an example?
Yeah. Here I should specify perhaps that primarily what I focus on is the policies, right? And so one of the things that was kind of in the paragraph indicating what I was supposed to speak about was effectiveness. So there's evidently a difference at times between what the policy says and what the practice is. So here I would kind of just give that as a disclaimer. Having said that, I think if you look at some of the measures, so not necessarily also those that we looked at, but platforms, networks that are adhering or trying to adhere to the Santa Clara principles on content moderation, I think that's a great way forward. And by the way, there's a review ongoing of that, which I can only encourage people to participate in. But the thing is, we have a lot out there in terms of kind of getting an understanding of what might be the right way forward. But there has to be that push and that harmonization to actually make that happen. So I don't think there's a lack of examples or a lack of initiatives kind of trying to push in that direction. And I do see it all coming together gradually, not least in the European context with some of the regulatory responses that are in preparation.
Great. Trisha, we're going to ask you one more question, which is coming in from Oren Levine, who's asking that enforcement at the content item level seems to be a nearly impossible task to make in a harmonized way. Are there any other approaches that you see at the publisher or the poster level, shifting the responsibility and the cost to publishers of harmful content?
Okay, so sorry, could you repeat the first part of that? I'm just not seeing it in the chat, otherwise I could read it.
Yeah, actually, that's a good reminder. I'd like to ask everyone in the chat to reply to everyone with your questions, because otherwise, actually, I as a moderator can't see your question if you reply to attendees. So please do reply to everyone. Thank you. So then this question is enforcement at the content item level seems to be nearly impossible without harmonized standards. So are there any possible other approaches at the publisher or the poster level that would shift the responsibility to publishers of harmful content? Is that clearer?
Yeah.
I guess the question is largely about harmonization, or that regulating or trying to make decisions on content is very difficult if there is not a harmonized set of standards. And this is where something like the Santa Clara principles provide a framework, but not necessarily enough precision. So how could we think about changing that approach to maybe it'll be something more process-oriented? How can we try to think more and to hold it? Actually, the question has clarified a little bit. It has to do with accountability and how can we hold different actors for account instead of content itself.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Difficult birth for the question, but there it is.
Yeah, no. So that's a really good point. And I do think that if you look at, it was kind of shown for Google and Facebook in the previous session of kind of how they determine what their guidelines are. There is a lot out there in terms of like how they're trying to decide on what content is. Their transparency reports do give some indication in that direction of how decisions have been made. And so I do think it is a lot more about and here as well, perhaps that's kind of a further response to what Claire was kind of hinting at, that we're not going to be able to give a label of this is always going to be harmful content or disinformation, etc. It's incredibly context bound. So that's not the point. The point is rather about knowing how kind of what the procedure is being made and being able to kind of go back and verify whether that actually has been sorry, I live next to a police station and a hospital, so there's constantly sirens. It's as if I live in a crisis environment constantly.
No worries.
Yeah, so it is far more about kind of having an indication of what the process is. I also think here, and kind of that became clear in us doing our analysis, platforms aren't the same. Take WhatsApp, for instance. WhatsApp is very different in terms of kind of the moderation that they do. It's very much hands-off. It's intentionally built that way as well. So if we are reflecting on kind of what we can harmonize, I think it is far more at the level of creating that transparency and creating those, ensuring that there always is appeal. And I would say in particular, when we're looking at automation, which is increasing, that is something that you need to be able to go back and figure out why that decision was made. And not just about the removal of content, for instance, but also just kind of getting that insight into why particular content was promoted or demoted, etc.
Okay. So I said that was the last question, but it was false information. I have one more question for you, Trisha, actually coming in from DisinfoLab, which is, this is of course a global conference, but there is a lot of focus now on European level regulation. So the question is the EU an appropriate level to be more aggressively or more proactively addressing content moderation? Is this a level where we can have this kind of harmonization, in your opinion?
I think we're big enough. I mean, there's never going to be a global agreement, right? And therefore, it might be nice to think of something that could work. But I do think that the EU has sufficient leverage, as we've seen with other policies in the past. I'm thinking especially in terms of privacy and data protection to kind of push towards that. And if the EU wants to be a norm setter, as it often contends that it wishes to be, then I think this is a very important policy area for it to continue pushing on.
Great. Thank you, Trisha. I think that's a good note to conclude on for this session. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to point our audiences also towards your work, and especially this ITU UNESCO report, which we'll be speaking about more in the next session. This is incredibly comprehensive, useful work for nerds out there in the subject, but also people who want an overview. I think it's a really great resource. So thank you, and thank you for joining us. And we will now, we're going to take a break for 10 minutes, and we're going to rejoin at 3:50 Brussels time for our final session of the day, which will be Civil Society's Response to the Infodemic. So we're going to be joined by Dr. Julie Posetti, the co-editor of this UNESCO report I just spoke about, as well as Claire Wardle of First Draft, Hubert Wu of the Oxford Internet Institute, and EU DisinfoLab's own Executive Director, Alexandre Alaphilippe. And that will be just in 10 minutes. So thank you again, Trisha, and thank you to our earlier presenters, and I hope that we will see you in 10 minutes or so.